Okay, so Lab 1, the language of anatomy and the organ systems. So we've kind of touched on this in lecture already with Chapter 1, but for lab, it's a bit different because for lab, you're going to have to know what you're looking at. Because in lab, it's anatomical. If I show you a picture of something, you need to tell me what I'm pointing to. For example, if I were to put this on, there we go, this on a slide and say, what is this? You would need to be able to tell me it's anatomical position. Anatomical position is when you've got a person facing you and their palms are facing forward. In other words, their thumbs are outward, their palms are toward you. Your feet are usually about shoulder width apart. Now you might go, okay, so what's the deal with anatomical position? Why is that important? Well, you have to remember that sometimes when patients come in, they're on their side on a stretcher or they're on their stomach. Sometimes, depending on what the injury is, they can't get into a regular position. So, you describing to the doctor where something is might not be as easy as you think it is. So, when you do that, when you've got a patient who's kind of in an odd position, you always imagine that they're in this position. That way, when you use directional terms to talk about where injuries are or where you see sores or things like that, the doctor will know this is how they're imagining the patient in this position. Because from this position, you know where superior is and inferior. You know where medial is and lateral. You know where distal is versus proximal. In this position, you know exactly where all of that is. So going back to the directional terms. Remember that with directional terms, there are always opposites. So there are always two sides to the coin. If there's an up, there's a down. If there's an in, there's an out. If there's a left, there's a right. Okay? So looking at directional terms, let's start with medial and lateral. Okay? So if I put a heart here and two sets of lungs, right? Because we have two lungs, you're always comparing 2 points on the body when you're doing directional terms. And it has to be on the body because you're describing the relationship between them. So for the heart with the lungs, okay, the heart is toward the middle of the body compared to the lungs. So if I were to describe that, I would say the heart is medial, this word, toward the middle, compared to the lungs. So the heart is medial compared to the lungs because instead of going out to the sides, it's toward the middle. Okay? Now, if I were to go the opposite direction and say, what are the lungs compared to the heart? Well, remember what I said. These words are always opposite. So if medial means toward the middle, lateral means toward the side, which is horrible. I'm sorry I'm writing like that. Okay, toward the side. So if we're talking about the lungs instead of the heart, we would say the lungs are lateral, meaning toward the side, compared to the heart. Okay? Again, you need 2 points on the body and you're describing them based on their position from each other. So that's the first set of words, medial and lateral. It's either toward the middle of the body or toward the sides of the body. And that's actually on this figure right here, medial versus lateral. Okay? Now, let's talk about up versus down. When we want to describe something that's higher than something else on the body, we use the word superior. It's higher. When we want to describe something that is lower on the body, we say the word inferior. Okay, so let's say we're talking about this girl's knee versus her ankle. Okay, or even this guy's knee versus his ankle. Okay, so the knee is blank to the ankle. Is it above it or below it? If it's above, if it's higher than, we say it's superior. So you would put superior here because the knee is superior, it's above that ankle. Okay? Now again, opposite sides of the coin. I'm going to use a different body part. Okay? So the head to the stomach. The head is head is blank to the stomach. What word would you use? Is it above it or is it below it? It's above, right? So you would use the term superior. So let's go with the wrist versus the elbow, okay? So again, we're using superior and inferior. The wrist is blank to the elbow. Is it above it or is it below it? Below, right? Because it's further down. So we would say the wrist is inferior to the elbow in this case, because we're specifically using those terms, okay? So we have medial and lateral that we just talked about, and we have superior and inferior. Now, something else with superior and inferior, you can also use the term cephalic or caudal. Cephalo means head, so it's toward the head. Caudal means tail, so it's toward the tailbone, okay, toward the bottom. A lot of times, and I mentioned this in the lecture in the I guess presentation for lecture, we use those terms when we're talking about four-legged creatures, okay? So we'll use those terms, cephalic or caudal, when we're talking about four-legged animals or animals that are oriented kind of in that same pattern where their stomach is facing the ground, because their cephalic, their head is not in a superior direction. Okay, so we've got superior, inferior as two opposite sides of a coin, medial and lateral, opposite sides of a coin. Now let's talk about the limbs specifically. Okay, so we're talking about the arms and we're talking about the legs. There is a specific set of terms, a specific couple of terms that we use when we're talking about the distance from the torso being this right here. And those two terms are only used when describing the limbs. So only used when we're describing the arms and the legs, okay? And those two terms are distal and proximal, okay? So, go with me on my stick figure journey. And that's the shoulder. We're just going to pretend like I drew a shoulder because I can't draw. How far away is the hand from the torso versus the shoulder? Okay, so we've got the shoulder versus the hand. Okay, remember with these terms, you always have to have 2 points on the body because you're describing the differences between 2 different places on the body. Okay, so the shoulder, if I could spell shoulder, shoulder is blank to the hand. Okay, so distal. What does that sound like to you? What word does it sound like? It sounds like distant, right? So distal means far away. Proximal, I always think of approximate, like it's close enough. So when I think of proximal, I think close. So is the shoulder closer to the torso or is it further away than the hand? Again, because we're comparing the two. The shoulder is closer, right? It's closer to the torso because it's here, not way the heck out here, right? So the shoulder is going to be proximal to the hand. Why? Because it's closer to the torso. Okay? Let's go with the other limb. Let's go with, excuse me, let's go with the leg. Okay? So with the leg, let's go with the thigh and the ankle. Okay? So if I were to say the ankle is blank to the thigh. Again, using the specific words proximal and distal, is the ankle further away than the thigh from the torso, or is it closer to the torso than the ankle? So the ankle is here versus here. Is this further or closer? It's further. So we would say the ankle is distal to the thigh. Again, remember with proximal and distal, with these two terms here, it's only the limbs. It's only arms and legs. Now, while I can use superior and inferior as well with the limbs, I can also use that in the actual body itself. I can say that the heart is superior to the stomach internally, but I can't use proximal and distal for that because both of those are in the torso. And when you're talking about proximal and distal, you're talking about whether or not something is close to that torso. If it's inside, that doesn't make sense. So, I'm trying to erase and it's not working. Get the eraser. Okay, so we've got the terms we've talked about so far. We've talked about proximal and we've talked about distal. We've talked about superior. We've talked about inferior. We've talked about medial and we've talked about lateral. Another set of directional terms, okay, are anterior and posterior. Now, simple. Anterior means in front, which is not one word, so I'm going to rewrite that. In front. Posterior means behind. Okay? So, if I were to draw a triangle here and a circle back here, okay, so I've got the triangle here and I've got the circle back here. The triangle is blank to the circle. Is it in front of the circle or is it behind the circle? It's in front of the circle, right? Because it's in front of his body. So in that case, you would use the word anterior, because the triangle is in front of the circle. It's anterior. That's just the proper term to use. The circle is blank to the triangle. So if the circle is back here, is it behind the triangle or is it in front of the triangle? It's behind. So again, using the proper term, you would say it's posterior. I said this in my lecture presentation. Honestly, if you need to say in front of and then switch out the words so that you know which word to put in, do that. There's nothing wrong with doing that, especially when you're learning. It wasn't like when I got into A&P, I automatically went, yes, I automatically know what that means, so I'll just use it correctly. I kind of had to come up with the way to do it as well. So if you have to say this is in front of that, which means anterior, take a second and do that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. Now, remember we had the term superior and inferior had cephalic as an option and caudal as an option. Well, you kind of have other options here too, ventral and dorsal, okay? And again, it's kind of the same thing. We kind of use the terms interchangeably in science because it's science and everything has to be super complicated. You can't just have one word for something when you can have 5. But also, it's because in front of and behind don't make sense for something like a shark. Go with me, it's a shark that has a dorsal fin, okay? That's not behind the shark because of how the shark's body is oriented. So dorsal means behind and ventral means in front of. And again, if you look at the term and you say, okay, this is, behind it, this is in front of it, you can kind of give yourself a little bit of a window of, it's okay for me to learn it this way. So if I've got specific organs or specific pictures and I'm pointing things out and I say, the ankle is blank to the whatever, I want you to use directional terms. If I put in the instructions using directional terms, describe to me or fill in the blank or something like that, okay? So you do need to know these terms. Again, we've got medial and lateral, we've got superior and inferior, we've got anterior and posterior, and we've got distal and proximal. Okay, the opposite sides of the coin, but they're paired together because one goes one direction, one goes the other. Now let's talk about the planes of the body. If there was a huge plate of glass and it fell from the ceiling and it cut me into right and left halves, that would be the sagittal plane. If it cut me right down the center of my nose, we would say it's mid-sagittal. But sagittal just means that you've got right and left halves. Whether they're equal or unequal, it's right and left halves. The transverse plane, which is down here, okay, actually cuts you into top and bottom halves. Again, it can be dead center in the middle of your body. It could be cutting your feet off from the rest of your body. It doesn't matter. If you're cut in that way, it is the transverse plane. The coronal plane means that you're cut into front and back halves. Now, this could be the tip of your nose, or it could be dead center in the middle of your head. But if you've got front and back parts to something being cut, that's the coronal plane. You can see here that we've got top and bottom halves. Top and bottom mean transverse plane. Okay, and again, I can put figures like this on your practical, and you're going to have to explain to me what this means, what plane this is. Now, the body cavities. We've got two major body cavities. The dorsal cavity, and up here in pink is the ventral cavity. Remember what I said about terms being interchangeable? So dorsal could also mean posterior. Ventral could also mean anterior. Okay? So in the dorsal body cavity, you actually have kind of two subcavities. You've got the cranial cavity, which contains the brain. The brain is located in the cranial cavity. It's the hole inside your skull that houses your brain. You also have the vertebral cavity. This is what contains your spinal cord. It's basically, in both cases, the bony shell that covers your soft organs. In the front, here's your diaphragm right here. You've got above that the thoracic cavity. Okay? And then below that, you've got a combo called the abdominopelvic cavity. Abdominopelvic is one word, it's just I couldn't fit it in. So the abdominopelvic cavity that is actually made of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity contains your stomach, it contains your liver, your gallbladder, most of your intestines, pretty much your digestive internal organs. The pelvic cavity contains the bladder, it contains the rectum, and the internal reproductive organs. So the uterus, the fallopian tubes, the ovaries. Now looking at it from the front, okay, here's my diaphragm again, okay. Here's my thoracic cavity, here's my abdominopelvic cavity, there's the abdominal cavity up here from basically here to here. And then the pelvic cavity is here. It's kind of the bowl that's created by the pelvis, by those bones. But up in the thoracic cavity, you actually have four different cavities. Above the heart, there's kind of this weird square-shaped cavity called the mediastinum. Okay? This houses the thymus, your superior vena cava, part of your esophagus, part of your trachea. They're all kind of located in that space. Now, around the heart, you have another cavity called the pericardial cavity. Peri means around, cardio means heart. So knowing that, you know exactly what's sitting inside of that. That's what holds the heart, okay? If you're in English and somebody says, okay, so this is the singular form of the word, and this is the other form that means more than one, you would say plural, right? So we actually have two cavities here. One around the right lung and one around the left lung. Okay, these are actually called the pleural cavities. and they house the lungs. So if I were to show you a picture of a lung and say, what cavity is this in? You would say the pleural cavity. If I were to show you the heart and say, what cavity is this in? You would say the pericardial cavity. If I were to show you the stomach and ask, what cavity does this sit in? It's in the abdominal cavity. Okay, you have to be very specific about what you're describing because they actually do have their own individual cavities. The quadrants versus the regions. So again, the abdominal cavity, that space, can be divided up into 4 quadrants. Quadrants are pretty easy. It's just based on location and side. Now remember something with right and left. You are always putting the right and the left monikers or names based on the patient, not on you. So it's not your right, it's their right. It's not your right, it's not your left, it's their left. So if you look, we've got the right upper quadrant over here. Then we've got the left upper quadrant. We've got the right lower quadrant over here, and we've got the left lower quadrant. Now you might be going, okay, but why do I need to know that? Again, it comes down to describing things on patients. If you're a paramedic and you're bringing a patient in who's been shot, you can say, we've got a bullet hole in the right lower quadrant. It's a through and through. The doctor knows exactly where to look. The doctor knows, okay, I need to make sure that I look in this area because they've already found that. Now, they might still check the rest of the patient, but they know for sure that there's at least one bullet hole in that place. And it's a way to kind of narrow down where you're telling them that it is. Because if you just tell the doctor, yeah, he's got a bullet hole. Yeah, good luck finding it. That's not helpful. But if you can kind of narrow the field for them, if you can kind of give them an idea of where they need to look, that's actually beneficial for the patient and saves quite a bit of time. Now, if you want to get even more specific, you can use the 9 regions. 9 regions are kind of like a tic-tac-toe because you've got 9 regions as opposed to 4 quadrants. Okay, you've got 3 different rows and you've got 3 different columns. So if you're a paramedic and you know that somebody's been hit, let's say in the umbilical region, you can kind of get more specific about what you're describing. I need to take a drink of water, I'm sorry. So looking at the first row, looking up here, again, right and left are the patient's right and left, not yours. So the right hypochondriac region is A1, that space. Now you're probably going, okay, hypochondriac, isn't that somebody who thinks they're sick but they're not? In biology, no. Hypo means below, chondro means cartilage. The rib cage. I'm going to go forward real quick. See here how the bottom of this rib cage is made out of cartilage? That is hypochondriac. It's right below that bit of cartilage in the rib cage, and it's on the right side. C1 over here has the left hypochondriac region because, again, it's right below that cartilage that makes up the bottom of the rib cage. If you learn prefixes and suffixes and the meanings of these bits of word, it'll help you later. Okay, so hypo means below, chondro means cartilage. So hypochondriac, below the cartilage region. Now, B1, this little dude right here, the epi gastric region. Epi means above. In anatomy and physiology, gastro means stomach. So if you look here, see that organ right there? That's the stomach. So that area is right above the stomach. So they call it the epigastric region. Now, second row. Okay, so we're here. We've got the right lumbar and the left lumbar regions. I'm going to go back to that skeleton. See these vertebrae right here? They're the biggest, thickest vertebra that we have, backbones that we have, and they're the lumbar vertebra. And that area I'm talking about is right here where these are. So we've got, we've got the right lumbar and we've got the left lumbar. Now look dead center in the middle, the umbilical region. What do you think could possibly be there? You're right, the belly button. Exactly. So, looking at the third row, we have the right iliac and we have the left iliac. Now you might be going, okay, what's iliac? Going back to the skeleton, do you see these big butterfly wings here on the pelvis? That bone is actually called the ilium. And the region that you're describing here is right in front of that big butterfly wing in the hip. So we call it the right iliac and the left iliac. Hypogastric. Hypo means, we just learned that, below. And then gastro means stomach. Well, there's the stomach. This is below the stomach. So you've got kind of these terms, or these, I guess I should say, regions, where you can narrow the field down if you're describing something to a doctor. With the directional terms, you also kind of help to narrow the field because you're describing something else to the doctor as well.